going to start way back when. So these that you're seeing right now, I hope you see, are from my first year. So I put them in because like my process, well, my paintings have always been about looking, and this is originally where I learned to look. These are all plein air paintings. So this is like my sort of base, I suppose. My history is in plein air painting, which taught me to look. And, you know, it's where I get a lot of my colors from. It's from looking and from life, essentially. So, yeah, I figured I'd throw them in because I do think they're relevant, but obviously it's not what I paint anymore. So we'll just move on to these. Okay. So after that was my first year, this was like a show I saw in between in London. So the umbrellas over here and this one on the right are, oh gosh, what's his name? This is bad already. But yeah, no, okay, so it'll come to me. I'll say it quickly. But so these are actually really impactful in that it taught me to question what painting was. Robert Rauschenberg. So these were his work from the 80s, and I remember seeing them and thinking, wow, I'd never thought to like do this with paintings that have like angles and like have two like parallel sort of surfaces. And Barnard as well has also been like one of my biggest influences, again, in terms of color and light and saturation in paint. So this was like this was my beginning of my second year where I really started to think to myself, well, why am I painting landscapes? That was it was something easy for me to do because I could always see one in Swansea, and it was an easy place for me to start. So I started to look at still lifes in my house, and this was like my flatmates' food they just kind of left around. So I started drawing still lifes to get more comfortable with like maybe starting to talk about things and narratives and ideas as opposed to just painting for the sake of painting. So these quickly developed into these two pieces here, and that's the original photo I used for the reference for the one on the right. But these two actually are one painting, and I was thinking about the idea of divided narratives, or just like what splits do in a painting. Like, because I've been painting horizons for so long, I started to think about what like an actual horizon does to a paint. So if you split it down the middle.
Oh dear.
And yeah, so I started thinking about like the continuation of a piece, like what becomes recognizable. And these candles didn't come until quite a long time after I thought I'd finished this piece, and I preferred them without. But we'll move on because there's a better example coming up. So this is when I just started to really sort of scrutinize like all the spaces I was like existing in, going to. So like drinking with friends in pubs, mostly the Hanbury actually. If you're from Swansea, you probably know it. These are all scenes from the Hanbury pool table. This is to the right of the pool table, if you know it. But yeah, no. So drawing became a big part of like, I guess, planning and understanding things, and just a sort of visual diary, I suppose, which led on to. So yeah, here's actually some more examples. These are nice. This was my studio in second year, but it led on to this. So this is really where stuff began moving for me in terms of painting. I started to think about the idea of spaces. I'd been reading Poetics of Space, a book which goes into detail of like, you know, describing spaces, but that was mostly to do with literature. And I started to think about, well, how does a space translate in painting? Because this is one scene, and when you put them together, it gives it a context. But this one on the right, on the left even, the bigger one, is just a sort of amalgamation of patterns and surfaces that, without the context of the right piece, it could have gone any which way on the wall. Like, there's no saying that this bottom brown bit is a wooden surface, and these are tiles. Like, if this had been shown landscape, I think I just found that interesting, this overlapping of figurative work, but then the abstract within it and what we see. And then obviously you do have the narratives and me giving spaces a context. So I was thinking of them as like lock and key pieces. And I did a few of them. So there's this one, again, an abstract piece on the right, essentially, without the context of the one on the left. And yeah, it came from a sort of desire to understand space better, and painting at the same time. These pieces, well, I mean, because I was giving them narratives, and I was thinking about the pub. The pub became an interesting space for me in that they're weird, because to describe a pub is a strange thing, because all walks of life go there. We go there to celebrate, like for weddings. You know, you have your uh, after party there, whatever it's called. But you also go there for a drink after a funeral. And I started to, I kind of like walked into a sort of really deep interest of pubs, and the fact that, you know, you could meet someone who's at their lowest, but also someone who's like at their best celebrating in a pub. So they became these sort of, there's a strong uh, sort of juxtaposition in pubs, and that's what these works were about, essentially. Sort of abstract versus figuration, happiness versus sadness, I suppose, is, if you want to go that deep into it. But yeah, no. And then obviously there's like the context of these pieces: 2 pints, people having a conversation, and just sort of about, it's just about things that happen in pubs, because I do think they're sort of not underrated, but sort of like, I think it goes often unsaid how important they are for British culture. Uh, so yeah, no, I really do think they're very important, and obviously we're losing more and more uh, over the years. Since 2001, we've lost, I think, like 13,000 pubs, like 13,000 closures, like locals, uh, and that was something I started thinking about as well, was why pubs are closing. And I came to a decision when I was in a Spoons, actually, and I started looking around, and I realized that they were sort of places like Spoons and chain pubs kind of appropriate a certain aesthetic, and they've got a formula almost for how to make a pub feel like a pub. You know, you don't go into a Spoons with like baby blue walls or like cold colors. It's always very warm. You know, the carpets are always like really dense, patterned, dark. And so this piece on the screen at the moment was a sort of me trying to come to grips with the idea of appropriating architecture almost, because that's what this is. It's a scene from a Spoons, if you know it. It's the Potter's Table down Kingsway in Swansea. There's a little section just before you go in the toilets that's like dark brown wood and then beige, and I wanted to sort of do what they did with your sort of typical local pub, which is what they used to be, like independent things owned by landlords, run by landlords, very independent. And then they took this aesthetic that had developed over however many years, and I wanted to do the same thing. I wanted to rip them off the way they'd sort of begun to rip off the idea of the pub. But yeah, I got kind of defensive over the idea of the local, and how local communities are losing more and more pubs, whether it be because of chain pubs like Spoons, which they do sell the cheapest booze because they can afford to, because they have so many chains, and then they're undercutting locals. And so this piece is about kind of like community in that sense, and rebelling against, I suppose, chain pubs and capitalism and all that jazz. But yeah, this piece is actually one of my favorites. I think it was like, I consider it one of my like cleverest ones, in that I was trying to appropriate what had already been appropriated in a sense. And obviously they don't like completely rip off pubs, but I guarantee somewhere in Britain you could find a pub that isn't a Spoons that has pretty much bang on the exact same wallpaper, wooden dado look. Like, yeah, I think it's become very formulaic, and I don't know if that's a good or a bad thing. Probably a bad one. But yeah, this was another piece I did. Same ideas, looking at light, because that's like, it's just something that's always interested me with landscapes, and these things creep into my work. The colors, like the warmth and the cold, the idea of like a pub being this sort of like, I think the aesthetic of the pub's kind of homely, if that makes sense. They're always warm. You've always got comfy chairs. You've got like the wooden, I think wood's a very sort of warm, comforting material, especially when it's like, you know, just left bare. But yeah, so these two pieces were kind of about appreciating the local pubs and like your communities in them, and like not just thinking of them as spaces where you drink, because they're not. They're you know, you mourn in them, celebrate. They're actually quite I don't know, they're intimate spaces, really. You learn to know the people in there. You recognize regulars. You become friends with bartenders. I'm sure we all have our own like experiences in pubs, because even people who don't drink, I think, have a space in the pubs where you go to eat or just talk with friends. Like, I do think they bridge a lot of barriers, in the sense of like, you know, class barriers. Like, you could be, you know, from a really wealthy family, but like you'd still go to your local pub for a drink at the end of a shift or something. Like, I do think they're a strange space that doesn't discriminate, and I think that's why I enjoy them so much. So yeah, so this was like, these two pieces were the end of my second year, and over the summer, I got to go to St. Ives, where they had a retrospective of an artist called Huguet Calland. And this really started making, this is me beginning to think about how I'm painting again. So I started thinking about forms, much like she has here. This is a pair of knees, and you know, it's obviously abstract, but it hints at like figurative forms, and I found that really interesting. And the colors she used as well. Like, I think this is like, I thought they were from the 70s, and I thought they looked ridiculously contemporary. These could have been painted like this year. I think, you know, they'd be accepted and praised as much as any other contemporary piece of artwork. So I felt it was interesting how they sort of bridged like over a time, in my opinion. So yeah, so then obviously after seeing these, I started to think about, well, how am I painting these surfaces? You know, I want to replicate, you know, these sort of really sticky, craggy, old wooden surfaces. And so I started to think about building up layers and how color could help me do that. But at the same time, trying to keep that sort of warmth and that sort of pub aesthetic. But this is my third year, was when I started really sort of like thinking like, well, what am I painting? Why are these relevant? Like, I wanted to look at the sort of occurrences that were happening in the pub, and to like, maybe, I think they reveal things about our culture and stereotypes. So yeah, I started to like think about, we'll come back to these in a sec. So this one, for instance, I started to think about like, well, how does drinking culture play into like, you know, British culture and the pub? And this is a kind of like, the pool cue became something I was really interested in. Like, it's this piece is quite crudely called Whiskey Dick. Like, I started to think about like how, like, as a man, going to the pub as an experience was. And I remember in the Hambria, I was watching two lads play pool, and this one lad, whenever he'd break, he proper smashed it, and the sound got me interested. Like, there was this really loud bang, and it was completely like, I don't know, overzealous, completely superfluous, the noise he made, because like, you know, the balls are going to go so far. But I thought like it was quite a performative thing, like this performative bravado that was happening. And I started to think about the crossover and how these sort of symbols, I suppose, could relay information, or perhaps reveal things from like the undercurrents of our culture. So yeah, so another thing I started doing in my third year was, I went back to thinking about painting and how I was doing it, and I started to think about, well, the edge of a painting is you've got a surface you can work with. And I started casting blue pool chalks, and when you play pool, you always chalk your cue for whatever reason. You just do it. And then you just kind of sort of absent-mindedly place the pool cue, the chalk down. And I thought it was really nice to sort of, again, appropriate these sort of actions and sort of mindless things that we all do, but perhaps we don't really think about, that I think are quite endearing of the pub. So that's what these were. And then around the edge of this painting here, if you can see this like slightly beige color, in vain, unfortunately, I tried throughout my entire third year to make a floppy pool cue out of like different materials. There was a foam one that broke. This one only was half cast because I didn't have quite enough rubber to like do a full mold. But again, I was interested in replicating things from the pub. So I tried to replicate the pool cue, but instead of just replicating it, I thought, well, I can do more with it. I don't just want to put a flat pool cue against the wall. I want to use it as a sort of medium to talk about things. And so I made it floppy, and like those, I don't have any images, unfortunately, but I had it like sort of drooping against the wall, like with its head hanging as if it was drunk. And then obviously the floppy pool cue became, for me, a sort of, it became about masculinity a little bit, and the idea of being hard and being floppy, etc. It was kind of like a joke, but it was also kind of like, you know, I was trying to be clever with it. But yeah, so these two pieces, this one here, again, you can't see very well, but there's a floppy pool cue there, and he's trying to chalk it. But yeah, this one was when I was thinking about scale in my work, because they're all quite small, these pieces. Like these ones were all like small pieces, like you could hold them with one hand, like not much bigger than, you know, I want to say like 12 by 12 inches, none were much bigger than that. So I wanted to like sort of scale up and start looking at these spaces on a grander scale to make them probably stand out more, I think, is what I was going for. I wanted to like zoom in, but also blow them up. So this one on the left, I actually took a step back from the pub for a moment and started thinking about drinking culture as a whole. And this one became about like sort of drinking games. So this is like a game of Ring of Fire playing out, and in someone's like awful student house with like a dirty magnolia wall and a dodgy lampshade, nasty looking shit mix in the middle, and then just a deck of cards strewn around. And it's like a sort of end of the night sort of vibe I was going for, because for a long time, until I think this piece on the left, my pieces, I'd removed figures from them. They were more about the space than they were about like people in, well, yeah, more about than like people in them. It was more about the actual space and perhaps what we were missing in those spaces. But I started to reintroduce the figure later on with like pieces like this. I started to think about actions, and like I say, like those two lads playing pool was a big sort of like aha moment for me, I suppose. It was a bit of an epiphany. I started to notice sort of idiosyncrasies, I suppose, maybe just like things that happened that, you know, you wouldn't pay much attention to. If you're just sat having a pint quietly and you hear a crack of a pool, you don't whip your head around. It's just a normal thing that happens. But when you really think about these things, I think they can become mediums to talk about greater issues within like a British culture. So yeah, so these two, again, reintroducing the figure. But when I reintroduced the figure, I wanted to be kind of critical about it. I wanted to talk about the figure the same way I talked about these spaces. So when I was describing the spaces and the wood and painting the wood and building up layers and looking at the grains and trying to replicate that sort of sticky, dark pub aesthetic, I wanted to think about like, what sort of people am I talking about? And so a term that's been coined quite recently, not really actually, it's probably an old one, but it's definitely resurfaced a lot more because of like the anti-BLM movements, is sort of gammons for like, you know, middle-aged over-white men. And I was painting these pink people, thinking about like, you know, these pubs that I was going to and British culture they're like very, I want to say white dominated spaces. In my experience, they are where I'm from. And it's, like I say, my practice comes from a sort of my experience of looking and thinking and scrutinizing. So when I go to these spaces, they're mostly filled with white people. So I started to think about this and the sort of culture around it, and and obviously there's sort of that, there's this the typical stereotypes of the color pink and how gendered it is, and I wanted to challenge that, and I wanted to challenge these sort of hard lads, this hard lad aesthetic, maybe by painting, this painting on the left was the sort of reaction to these two lads playing pool, smacking the balls, and there's so many innuendos, but like I just find that they all line up nicely next to each other. Well, I say nicely, I mean like they cause a lot of tension with each other. But obviously, I mean, like, times are changing a lot, and these maybe aren't as truthful to the real sort of demographics who go pubs as I'm trying to make out. But I do think that, like, even outside of like me saying it, though, that they're pink hard lads, it's not about that. They're quite sensitive as well, and there's toxic masculinity was something I was thinking about, and I was thinking like, well, as an artist, it's something, I don't know, it's something I've thought about. It's something I realize that I'm probably a part of. I'm definitely a part of. And so there's a bit of me in these as well, I want to say. Because I've definitely been this person at the pool table. And like I say, the pool table became this sort of, it's a sport essentially. But it's like a bar sport, I suppose. But the idea of sports, the idea of masculinity, the idea of the pink hands, the sort of soft blending of colors, these really slick lines. It was just this sort of challenging of, a lot of classic British manhood, I suppose, or what we think of as classic British manhood, which is, something that's open for debate even now. But yeah, so I guess there's a lot going on, and that's something else that I think about with my paintings is I want them to be accessible. I think there's a lot of umming and ahhing, and there's no real succinctness in like British, well, politics. Let's just go there. Like there's no real solidity, and I want my paintings to be quite solid in what I don't want to sort of overcrowd a canvas with like 20 figures. I'm interested in these small moments that can be interpreted and read. And I think there's an immediacy that I think's kind of necessary for right now for Britain, because I think there's a certain lack of it, a certain lack of, what's the word? I guess there's no sort of rock. There's no real idea of solidity. Like I think there's a lot of problems in culture, in our culture at the moment, with the BLM protests, the anti-BLM protests, the politics, the lockdown. It's all just a bit up in the air, and I think what's missing is, something solid. Like, for instance, a solid leader, someone you can put your trust in. And so my paintings, I kind of want to have that solidity, because it's something that I do believe we lack as a country. But yeah, so yeah, I showed these pieces. This was the only time I've showed these, because this was like a small show in Bubble in Swansea. So I figured I'd throw it in just for like, well, nostalgia's sake, I suppose, because obviously lockdown hit not long after this, and I was never able to show them anywhere else. Actually, this piece on the left was recently shown in Umbrella in Cardiff, which is, post-lockdown. I don't know, is it really post? But no, I just wanted to include them so you could see sort of like how they sit next to each other. Oh, but yeah, I actually never talked about these ones, did I? Okay, yeah, so these two. Again, so these came primarily from looking at the wooden surfaces. I started to look at other surfaces in the pub. So yeah, all of my work is kind of like, I suppose, little sort of riffs on different things and, you know, actions and surfaces and space and people in pubs. So these were the sort of ones I looked at in terms of surface, and I was quite strict with them. They're all the same size. There's a series of about 7 or 8 of them, but I just chose these two because I think these two are the most effective. So this one here on the right is a corner of a sort of bench, and it's like a really weathered piece of fabric, but it was still this sort of really nice bright red, but then obviously it got like dirty at the crevices, and I was interested in that sort of, I suppose it reveals a certain amount of time, and sort of building up of perhaps this aesthetic that I keep talking about. Same with these tiles. I think, you know, tiled bathrooms and urinals, as sort of dirty and hanging as they are, they're quite endearing. So I wanted to paint them and appropriate them, I suppose. So yeah, where are we up to? Oh, and these were a couple of drawings in that same show me and my friend did, as a sort of like, you know, we were looking at kind of the British politics and the idea of something living and dying. It was very, we were very dark about it. But yeah, no, they all went hand in hand with the idea of like the, I want to say the pub dying and the locals dying and things being lost. So yeah, okay, so this is the beginning of work I made over lockdown. And this is where like the first two I did with these two, and these are from images I had on my phone, which isn't something I do. I don't normally, like, when I do my paintings, I don't often draw from photos. I'll have a collection of photos and maybe I'll merge a couple together, or I'll just do it off the top of my head. But these two I did as a way to like sort of ease myself back into this process and start questioning again, what is it I'm painting? Because I couldn't go to pubs anymore. They'd all been closed down. So I did these as a sort of comfort thing. But I realized like there was a certain, I want to say a lack of agency. It just didn't feel as relevant. It was almost as if they were just nostalgic of a time that's been like lost. I don't know. I wasn't really feeling them. They just felt a bit wrong. So I started to, I did what I always do, and I started looking again. And like I say, my practice has always been rooted in me just looking at my surroundings. And so I started to paint the day-to-day life, I suppose. And I was casting things at home as well, like the little mug handle down here, and attaching them to canvases. Again, just kind of like stealing from things, like real things, attaching them to my canvases, you know, questioning why, you know, do canvases end where the canvas ends? But I kind of like knuckled down and I started thinking, well, at the end of the day, what I'm interested in is Britain as a whole. It's not just the pub, though I do think the pub is still a really important space that I'm not finished with. But so I started painting these, and this was a scene from my back garden. We were having a barbecue, and this is my old man putting his belt on before going to work. And I started to think about sort of middle classness. And I didn't paint them with this in mind, but I kept thinking about it in context of the pub and how they're. Now you can argue with me on this one because I'm not particularly sold on it myself, but they do feel like working class spaces. That's just how they come across. I started to think about sort of like middle classness in relation to the pub, and perhaps that's why places like your local are taken for granted, because you can just go to spoons, and I do kind of pin it on. Ooh, do I? I do kind of pin it on sort of a blaseness that perhaps we have when, it's easy to say, oh, I'm going to go spoons because, it's $2.20 for a Carling there as opposed to £3. But, it's all about, I guess, investing in things. But you kind of forget that. You don't think of these spaces as things that can be lost. And yeah, I think it is a lack of agency in sort of deciding. Like, you'd think going for a pie wouldn't be that big of a decision at the end of the day, but I do think there's a politics to it. But yeah, so this one on the right is a sort of about like working days and the sort of working class ethic of Britain, the sort of grind for however many years. And I was thinking about the sort of cyclical nature of work and kind of how depressing it is. And again, the pink hand coming into it, thinking about like, how maybe it's expected of some people, depending on your background, to just get a job and crack on with work. And yeah, it's probably not just a British problem, but it's something that I think sticks out as well in Britain. Oh yeah, and this is so I started making sort of video work over lockdown, which is not something I thought I'd do. It's a bit dodgy looking, this one, but that's the actual reference I used for putting his belt on. So yeah, again, I was looking at color as well. I suppose I haven't really spoke about apart from the pinks, but yeah, highly saturated colors have always been a go-to for me because I'm not interested in painting convincing figures or hands. You can tell that's a hand. You can tell both of these are hands, and they're both simple silhouettes. But the color can yeah, I think it's just about like breaking things down to their like bare necessities, I suppose. Like this pink hamburger, a pink sausage, yellow sweet corn. I think it's kind of like important, again, the idea of having this sort of immediacy and solidity in my works. And I find that by using brighter colors and not mishmashing about with tones and building up layers too much and trying to paint a hand that's realistic and convincing, instead I can do it through symbols. And through symbols is how we primarily like sort of communicate anyway. So by like using sort of simpler symbols as a way to communicate bigger ideas, I find I'm able to like create convincing compositions. Like the one on the left, the barbecue one, I'm not sold on that one personally. I don't like it. But this one on the right, I think it's again that simplicity, that sort of tight composition, and the bright colors, the sort of blue denim jeans, the working man's jeans, the white top tucked in, with a bit of like the gut hanging out. I find that very sort of like all these tiny little nuances can convey a lot, and I think they're quite familiar to a lot of people. So yeah, this was another one. This one I really sort of like blurred out, and I was like thinking about the idea of like that sort of aesthetic of homeliness. And I was thinking about, well, in the pub, I've always said is a homely space because of the warm colors. So I kind of wanted to like focus more on the colors and the gesture, like I always do with hands. Like the hand coming in, I think is something that would be akin to something I could paint, like a hand reaching for something. And again, like I'm not trying to like be realistic. I am trying to be realistic in that I want to talk about and I want to feel these sort of like moments, as opposed to like, look at me, I can paint a hand or I can paint portraits. I'm trying to talk about what it means instead of that to like paint people in this day and age, maybe. And this was another one I did, just a foot tapping, sort of like blaseness again. So yeah, these are some others I did over lockdown. The one on the left was actually based off the GIF, sorry, that just went past. And, I was thinking very summary. I wanted to like use color as a way, sort of like, I don't know, talk about mood and temperature, and, just like, I feel like it comes across very summary, and that's what I was going for more than anything. I wanted this really sort of like pop, summer, in your back garden with your sandals on sort of vibe that I think, we can all relate to. The middle one this was actually one of my earlier ones again from lockdown. I was still sort of like refusing to move on from the pub. And this one was titled Beer Drinker. And I actually had a bit of a revelation with this one in that I had started using black to outline my works. And I think it became a bit too harsh. And it lacked what perhaps the earlier piece I showed you of like the pull cue hand, which was outlined in pink. There was no black. And I think in terms of style and in terms of impact, I think it really got in the way. So yeah, I went back to like these colored lines, really bright, saturated, summery vibe again. I really was thinking about sort of vibes of pieces. And then this one was a self-portraited, and I was just looking at layering colors. And again, summer vibes with the glasses. Yeah, it's actually hard to talk about the lockdown pieces because I really was just grinding them out for the sake of it, because it was like my third year. I was like, I've got to keep going. There was that pressure. I think if I hadn't have been in my third year, I probably wouldn't have painted that much. So I don't know if it's a good thing that I felt compelled to continue painting. I'm sure other people in here can, like, who are other artists can probably relate. And this is the last image in the slide, and these were sort of, so what I showed you was sort of me cherry picking my better paintings throughout the whole thing. I've been cherry picking like what I consider my best pieces, but I wanted to put these in because these are like proper. This was like me mid proper struggle, like during the lockdown. These were I consider these probably some of my worst pieces. They're just oil on paper, and yeah, I mean, I was painting things like this was my sister's hand, the one on the right, playing a Nintendo Switch, and to this day, I just don't think that's relevant. I don't know why I painted it. I just felt compelled, and lockdown as an artist, I suppose, especially like when my main sort of reference point was somewhere that had gone, like the pub. I couldn't get there. I had images, but it's not the same. Like I ended up painting a couple of pieces over lockdown that I've recently brought back with me to Swansea, and I've got my old pieces back, and I've compared them, and it's just completely lacking. I got so complacent with color, with the sort of marks making, with the process. It's almost like I'd forgotten everything and thrown it out. And I think it was because I wasn't going to these spaces and experience, and I forgot to think about what it feels like to be in a pub. And they got really poppy and sort of really flat and kind of awful. But yeah, I wanted to end on a kind of honest note of the struggle is real. But yeah, no. Yeah. So yeah, these are all just sort of like, this is the old man doing his belt again. This was just a trainer. I started painting flowers. My friend's ear on this was off a Zoom. We did the classic Zoom pub quiz every week over lockdown. And this was me pulling up some socks. I mean, it just got really hard to like do anything. But, I'm sure we can all relate. Over lockdown, things got harder, just in general. But yeah, no, that's actually, I think that's me done now.